There exists in the South Carolina Historical Society archives a sealed document dated March 1847, marked with a warning that still chills researchers who discover it, contains testimony too disturbing for public record. May God forgive what men have done. Inside those yellowed pages lies the testimony of 8 plantation owners who suffered identical horrific injuries over a span of 11 years, each man castrated with surgical precision. Each attack occurring within 24 hours of a specific unspeakable act. The perpetrator was never caught, never identified in official records, but whispered accounts among freed slaves after the Civil War spoke of a man they called Silas the Silent, a field hand who could not scream, whose vocal cords had been damaged beyond repair, and who exacted a revenge so methodical and terrifying that even his fellow enslaved people feared to speak his name aloud. What you are about to hear is the reconstruction of events that South Carolina authorities deliberately obscured. A pattern of violence so disturbing that it was easier to pretend it never happened than to confront what it revealed about the plantation system itself. Before we continue with the story of Silas and the 8 men who fell victim to his calculated fury, I need to ask you something. This channel exists to bring you the darkest, most unsettling true stories from American history, the ones that textbooks won't touch. If you appreciate content that doesn't shy away from historical horror, hit that subscribe button right now. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment with your state or city. Now, let's descend into one of the most disturbing cases of revenge in American history. The sealed testimony wasn't opened by accident. It was the persistence of a graduate student in 2003 that brought these events back to light, and what she found would haunt her research for years to come. The South Carolina Lowcountry in 1836 was a landscape of contradictions, breathtaking natural beauty concealing systematic human suffering. The region's rice plantations generated extraordinary wealth for a small class of white landowners, built entirely on the forced labor of thousands of enslaved African Americans who toiled in mosquito-infested fields where malaria and dysentery killed as readily as overwork. Charleston, 40 miles to the east, presented a facade of genteel Southern culture, grand balls, literary societies, churches with soaring steeples, while the surrounding countryside operated as an interconnected network of labor camps where human beings were bought, sold, bred, and worked to death with impunity. The Lowcountry plantation belt stretched along the coastal plain where the intersection of tidal rivers and rich soil created ideal conditions for rice cultivation. But rice agriculture was punishing work. Enslaved workers stood knee-deep in water for hours, vulnerable to snakes, alligators, and disease, their hands torn bloody from the sharp-edged rice stalks. The heat in summer was suffocating, the air thick with humidity and insects. Winter brought cold rains that soaked through thin clothing. The enslaved population on these plantations significantly outnumbered their enslavers, sometimes by ratios of 20 or 30 to 1, which created a permanent atmosphere of fear among white plantation owners. This fear manifested in brutal discipline, complex systems of surveillance, and punishments designed not just to control but to terrorize. Into this world, in approximately 1815, a child was born who would be given the name Silas. His mother, according to fragmentary records, was named Patience, a woman who worked in the fields of the Rutledge plantation near Georgetown. His father's identity was never recorded, though plantation ledgers noted that Patience's child was mulatto, indicating a white father. This detail, seemingly minor, would prove significant in the rigid caste system of plantation society. The children of enslaved mothers and white fathers occupied a peculiar position, legally enslaved through their mother's status, yet bearing the features of their oppressor fathers, which often marked them for special resentment or unwanted attention. Silas grew up in the quarters, the crowded wooden structures where enslaved families lived in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. The buildings leaked in rain, sweltered in summer, and provided little warmth in winter. Privacy was impossible. Families were separated on the whim of economic necessity. Children sold away from parents, husbands from wives. The psychological toll of this instability was immeasurable. Yet within these communities, people created networks of support, passed down African traditions mixed with Christian teachings, sang songs that encoded messages of resistance, and found ways to maintain their humanity in a system designed to deny it. By age 7, Silas was working in the fields. Plantation records from the Rutledge estate preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society list him in 1008. 122 as field hand, small tasks. By 10, he was doing full adult labor. Those who knew him in these years, according to later oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, remembered a quiet boy who learned quickly and seemed to observe everything with unusual intensity. One elderly, formerly enslaved person interviewed in 1937 recalled, "My granddaddy told me about a boy named Silas who never spoke much even as a little child, had light skin and gray eyes that looked right through you, said that boy saw things other children didn't see, remembered things it was safer to forget." The South Carolina Lowcountry had a reputation even among other slave states for exceptional brutality. The demographics, enslaved people outnumbering whites so dramatically, created paranoia among plantation owners, especially after the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1008-122, when Charleston authorities uncovered an alleged plot for a massive slave uprising. Though the conspiracy's full extent remains debated by historians, the white response was unambiguous. 35 black men were hanged, and restrictions on enslaved people became even more severe. The patrol system intensified, with armed white men riding the roads at night, stopping any black person found without a written pass. Literacy among enslaved people was already illegal. Now even religious gatherings without white supervision were banned. The message was clear: resistance of any kind would be crushed with overwhelming violence. It was into this atmosphere of heightened repression and fear that Silas entered adolescence. He was 13 years old in 1828 when something happened that changed him forever. The exact details are unclear, lost to the deliberate silence that surrounded such events. But plantation records from the Rutledge estate show that in October of that year, Silas was treated by a doctor for severe throat injuries. The medical notation is clinical and brief. Slave boy, approximately 13 years, damage to larynx and vocal cords, cause undetermined, recommended observation. A separate entry in the plantation ledger, in a different hand, notes, Silas unable to work, recovering from discipline incident. The word discipline covered multitudes of horrors on plantations, from whipping to branding to mutilation. From that point forward, Silas could not speak normally. According to accounts gathered decades later, he could make sounds, grunts, whispers, occasionally a strangled approximation of words, but his voice was destroyed. The damage was permanent. Whether this was the result of a beating, a deliberate punishment, or something else was never officially recorded. What is certain is that from age 13 onward, Silas the Silent, as he came to be known, moved through the plantation world as a presence both invisible and deeply unsettling. His inability to speak made him seem less threatening to some overseers, more disturbing to others. He was a ghost in plain sight, working without complaint, watching without comment. The Rutledge plantation, like others in the region, operated on a task system rather than gang labor. Enslaved workers were assigned specific tasks each day: a certain amount of rice to thresh, a field to hoe, ditches to dig, and once completed, their time was theoretically their own. In practice, tasks were often impossible to complete within daylight hours, forcing people to work late into the evening. But the system did allow for small pockets of autonomy. gardens where enslaved people grew their own food, opportunities to earn tiny amounts of money by selling surplus produce or fish caught in rivers. These small freedoms were crucial for psychological survival, creating spaces where people could exercise choice, however limited. Silas, according to oral histories, used his evening hours differently than most. He watched, he listened, his silence made people forget he was there, and in that invisibility he learned things. He learned the patterns of the overseers, which ones drank heavily, which ones disappeared into the quarters at night. He learned the schedules of the patrol riders, the gaps in their routes. He learned which plantation owners visited other plantations and why. And he learned, though no one spoke of it openly, which men among the enslavers considered enslaved women, and sometimes enslaved boys, as sexual property, a right that came with ownership. The first incident occurred on a humid night in August 1836, though its full significance wouldn't be understood until much later. The victim was Nathaniel Grayson, a 32-year-old plantation owner whose property bordered the Rutledge estate. Grayson was found in his bedroom at dawn by his wife, conscious but in shock, blood soaking through the bedsheets. He had been castrated with what the doctor who treated him described as almost surgical precision. The bedroom door had been locked from the inside. The windows were shuttered and latched. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of struggle beyond the injury itself. Grayson, when he could speak, claimed he had woken to a hand over his mouth, a flash of metal, and pain so intense he lost consciousness. He saw nothing, heard nothing except breathing, steady, controlled breathing. The local sheriff, Benjamin Carr, investigated with the assistance of the slave patrol. Every enslaved person on Grayson's plantation was interrogated. Several were whipped on suspicion, a common practice designed more to reassert control than to extract information. Nothing useful emerged. Grayson's wife insisted no enslaved person had been in the house that evening. The house servants, questioned separately, confirmed they had been locked in their quarters, as usual at nightfall, a practice Grayson followed religiously. The investigation stalled within days, and while rumors spread among white society, theories of revenge, whispers of abolitionist conspiracies, no arrest was made. What the sheriff's report didn't include, because Grayson refused to speak of it, was what had happened the previous afternoon. A field hand from the neighboring Rutledge plantation, a young man named Silas, had been loaned to Grayson for the day to assist with repairs to a rice mill. Such temporary transfers were common, a system of mutual assistance among plantation owners. The work had taken until evening, and rather than send Silas back in darkness, Grayson had kept him overnight in a storage shed near the main house. Grayson had visited that shed around 10:00 that evening. He was there for approximately half an hour. When he emerged, adjusting his clothing, Silas emerged behind him, moving slowly, his face unreadable. Grayson told his overseer to return Silas to the Rutledge plantation at first light. That was the last coherent order he gave before the attack. No connection was made. Grayson himself never mentioned Silas's presence on the property. To do so would have required explaining why he'd visited the shed late at night, and such an admission would have raised questions Grayson had no intention of answering. In the honor culture of the Southern plantation elite, certain things were understood but never acknowledged. Sexual access to enslaved people was simultaneously a casual practice and an unmentionable reality. To speak of it openly was to violate social codes that maintained the fiction of white gentility. So Grayson suffered in silence, eventually telling people he had been attacked by an unknown intruder, possibly a runaway slave who had mysteriously gained entry to his locked bedroom. Silas returned to the Rutledge plantation. He worked in the fields. He said nothing because he could say nothing. His face betrayed no emotion. Life continued. 18 months passed. Then, in February 1838, a second incident occurred. The victim this time was Thomas Wright, owner of a medium. sized plantation 12 miles south of the Rutledge property. Wright was 41 years old, married with 4 children, a respected member of his local church. He was found by his overseer in the plantation office, a small building separate from the main house, castrated in the same precise manner as Grayson. The door had been bolted from inside. Wright was unconscious from blood loss and shock. He survived but remained unable to provide any useful description of his attacker. He claimed he remembered nothing. He had been working late on account books, and the next thing he knew, he was waking in agony. The sheriff investigated again. This time, the similarities to the Grayson case were noted. 2 plantation owners, both attacked in locked rooms, both suffering identical injuries, both unable to identify their attacker. Theories proliferated. An organized slave rebellion, a campaign by abolitionists, a disturbed individual with a grudge against the planter class. The investigation again focused on enslaved people in the area, particularly those who had demonstrated any independence of spirit or intelligence that might suggest capacity for such a crime. Several men were arrested, interrogated harshly, and held for weeks before being released for lack of evidence. Once again, a critical detail went unreported. 2 days before the attack, Wright had traveled to Georgetown to conduct business. While there, he had negotiated the short-term rental of an enslaved worker skilled in carpentry. The Rutledge plantation, looking to generate additional income, had begun renting out some of their more skilled enslaved workers to other plantation owners for temporary projects. Silas, despite his inability to speak, had learned carpentry skills and was considered a competent worker. He had been sent to Wright's plantation to repair damage to several outbuildings. The work took 3 days. Silas slept in a locked tool shed, ate meals brought to him by the plantation cook, and worked steadily from dawn to dusk. On the second evening, Wright visited the tool shed. He stayed for some time. When he left, Silas remained inside. The next day, Silas completed his work and returned to the Rutledge plantation. The day after that, Wright was found castrated in his office. No connection was made because no one was looking for a connection. The idea that an enslaved person, particularly one who could not speak, could not cry out, could not even tell anyone what was happening to him, might be capable of such calculated revenge was unthinkable within the worldview of plantation society. Enslaved people were property, incapable of the kind of strategic thinking required for such acts. That they suffered was acknowledged with indifference. That they might respond with methodical violence was beyond consideration. But among the enslaved communities of the Low Country, whispers began, nothing explicit, nothing that could be traced or used as evidence, but a pattern of knowing glances, careful silences. The name Silas was mentioned in contexts that suggested more than his carpentry skills. An elderly woman interviewed decades later recalled, "We knew there was somebody making those white men pay. Didn't know for certain who, but there was talk about a man who couldn't speak, who moved like a shadow. People were scared of him, but not the way you'd be scared of something evil. More like how you'd be scared of a storm. You know it's coming, you know it's powerful, and you just try to stay out of its way." By 1840, 4 plantation owners in the South Carolina Lowcountry had suffered the same fate. Each attack followed an identical pattern: locked rooms, no sign of forced entry, surgical precision, no useful description of the attacker. The victims, Grayson, Wright, and now Edmund Talbot and Henry Prescott, had little in common on the surface. They were different ages, owned plantations of different sizes, belonged to different social circles. The only thread connecting them was geography. All lived within a 20-mile radius. All were part of the interconnected economic network of rice plantations that defined the region. The attacks had created a climate of fear among the planter class. Locked doors no longer felt secure. The presence of enslaved people in and around homes, once taken for granted, now generated paranoia. Some plantation owners began sleeping with loaded pistols. Others installed additional locks, hired extra overseers, increased the brutality of their control measures in hopes of intimidating potential attackers. The slave patrols intensified their night raids, stopping and questioning any black person found on the roads after dark. But the attacks continued, unpredictable in timing but consistent in method. What the plantation owners didn't know, what they couldn't know, because they had never paid attention to the movement of enslaved workers between plantations, was that Silas had been present on each property in the days immediately before each attack. The Rutledge plantation had developed a profitable side business renting out skilled enslaved workers, and Silas, with his carpentry abilities and his unsettling silence, was frequently loaned to other plantations for short-term projects. He was invisible, a tool rather than a person in the eyes of those who rented his labor. The pattern was never documented in any official record, but it was there. Silas would arrive at a plantation, work diligently for several days, sleep wherever he was assigned, usually a shed or storage building separate from the main slave quarters, and complete his tasks efficiently. And on some of these plantations, not all, but some, a particular owner would visit him in the night. What happened during those visits was never discussed, never recorded, existed only in the private hell of those who experienced it and the cold calculation of the one who remembered. Then Silas would return to the Rutledge plantation, and within 48 hours the man who had visited him would be found castrated, often in a locked room, the attack executed with such speed and silence that even a wife sleeping in the same house might hear nothing. The investigation, such as it was, remained fragmented because no one connected the attacks. Each incident was treated as separate, investigated by local authorities who communicated poorly with their counterparts in neighboring jurisdictions. Sheriff Carr, who had investigated the first two cases, was now convinced he was dealing with a serial attacker, but his attempts to coordinate a broader investigation met resistance. Plantation owners were reluctant to discuss the attacks openly, partly from shame at their injuries, partly from fear of encouraging copycat crimes or slave insurrections. The South Carolina Gazette published brief reports of violent incidents on lowcountry plantations, but deliberately avoided details that might inspire panic or provide information to potential attackers. In the enslaved communities, a different kind of knowledge circulated. People knew that certain plantation owners were being targeted. They knew that whatever was happening, it was justice of a kind their legal system would never provide. Enslaved women, particularly those who had been repeatedly raped by white men, spoke in encoded language about the Silent One, who made men pay, but they also knew that openly celebrating or even acknowledging these attacks would bring collective punishment. After each incident, slave patrols would sweep through the area, interrogating people, destroying property, inflicting violence randomly to reassert control. So the knowledge remained underground, shared in whispers, never written down, never spoken where it might be overheard. Silas himself remained an enigma even to those who lived alongside him in the Rutledge quarters. He worked steadily, ate his rations, slept in his assigned space. He had no family on the plantation. Patients had died of fever in 1830, and he had never known siblings. He formed no close friendships, participated minimally in the community life of the quarters. His silence was both explanation and barrier. How do you befriend someone who cannot speak, whose face shows no readable emotion, whose eyes seem to look through you rather than at you? An elderly man named Joshua, who had worked alongside Silas in the rice fields for years, told an interviewer in 1936, Silas wasn't like other folks. Something happened to him when he was young, something that broke him inside even more than it broke his voice. He'd work all day in the heat, cutting rice until his hands bled and he wouldn't make a sound. Overseers liked that at first, thought he was broken good, but there was something in his eyes that made smart people nervous. He was watching, always watching, like he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't see, and when he looked at certain white men, there was something in that look that made you think of deep water, the kind that drowns you slow. The Rutledge plantation owners, the family that legally owned Silas, never suspected him of anything. He was valuable property, a skilled worker who could be rented out for additional income, quiet and obedient. If anything, his inability to speak made him seem more trustworthy. He couldn't spread rumors, couldn't organize resistance, couldn't even cry out if something happened to him. He was, in their eyes, the ideal slave, productive, silent, and utterly controlled. But control was an illusion. Silas had learned, through years of observation and bitter experience, how plantation society functioned. He understood the rhythms of plantation life, the patterns of white movement and black restriction. He knew that enslaved people were expected to be in certain places at certain times, that deviation from routine invited suspicion and punishment. He knew that his silence, which made him vulnerable, also made him forgettable. Overseers would speak freely in his presence, discussing matters they would never mention around enslaved people they believed could gossip. White men would use him and then dismiss him from their minds, confident that a mute slave posed no threat. They were catastrophically wrong. By 1842, the count had reached 6. 2 more plantation owners, Robert Finch and Charles Hammond, had joined the list of victims. The attacks were no longer isolated incidents that could be dismissed as random violence. The Charleston Mercury published an editorial calling for a coordinated investigation, suggesting that a disturbed individual or organization of malcontents was targeting the plantation class. Rewards were offered for information. The governor authorized additional militia resources to support local law enforcement, but the investigation continued to flounder because the victims, almost without exception, refused to provide certain information. None would discuss their activities in the hours immediately before the attacks. None would acknowledge the presence of particular enslaved workers on their properties. To do so would have required admitting to behaviors that, while common, were supposed to remain unspoken. The honor culture of the Southern elite valued reputation above almost all else. A man might rape enslaved women and boys with impunity, but to acknowledge such acts publicly was to lose standing in society. Better to suffer in silence than to admit the truth. This silence protected Silas more effectively than any deliberate plan. The pattern was there, waiting to be discovered, but no one with the authority to investigate was willing to look in the direction that would reveal it. And so the attacks continued, each one a precise, methodical act of revenge that left its victim alive but destroyed, capable of knowing what had been done to him but powerless to name his attacker. Just when the investigation seemed hopelessly stalled, an unexpected witness emerged who would threaten to unravel everything. Her name was Dinah, a house servant on the Hammond plantation, and she had seen something the night Charles Hammond was attacked, something she couldn't forget, no matter how much she wanted to. Dinah was 34 years old in 1842, a woman who had spent her entire life enslaved on various lowcountry plantations. She had been sold twice, once as a child when her original owner died, once as a young woman when a plantation went bankrupt. The Hammond plantation was her third place of bondage. As a house servant, she occupied a complicated position in the plantation hierarchy. House slaves generally had better food, better clothing, and less physically demanding work than field hands. But this proximity to white owners came with its own terrors. House servants saw and heard things, marital conflicts, financial troubles, private cruelties, that made them uniquely vulnerable. Knowledge was dangerous for enslaved people. Witnessing things you weren't supposed to see could get you sold, beaten, or killed. On the night of Charles Hammond's attack, Dinah had been sleeping in a small room off the kitchen, as was customary for the cook and primary house servant. Around 2:00 in the morning, she woke to use the chamber pot and heard something. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. It was a footstep on the stairs leading to the second floor, where the family bedrooms were located. This staircase was old, and certain steps creaked predictably. Dinah knew those sounds intimately, had climbed those stairs countless times each day. What she heard was someone moving slowly, carefully, testing each step to minimize noise. She should have stayed in her room. Every instinct of survival told her to remain silent, to see nothing, to know nothing. But curiosity, or perhaps some deeper intuition, drew her to the doorway. The house was dark except for a single candle she lit, shielding its light with her hand. She moved to where she could see the staircase. A figure stood at the top, barely visible in the darkness. The silhouette was male, lean, moving with careful deliberation toward Hammond's bedroom. For a moment, Dinah's heart stopped, thinking she was witnessing a murder in progress. Then the figure turned slightly, and candlelight caught his face for just an instant. She recognized him, Silas, the carpenter from the Rutledge plantation, who had been working on the property for the past 3 days, repairing the gallery railings and several window frames. He had been locked in the tool shed each night, or so everyone assumed. Clearly, he had found a way out. As Dinah watched, frozen in her doorway, Silas reached Hammond's bedroom door. She expected it to be locked. Hammond locked his door every night, paranoid about the recent attacks on plantation owners. But the door opened silently. Silas slipped inside. The door closed. Dinah stood, paralyzed with indecision. She should wake someone, should raise an alarm, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of Hammond's visits to the quarters, the way he selected women with the casual authority of someone choosing fruit at market. Perhaps it was the knowledge that whatever was about to happen, she wanted no part of it. Perhaps it was recognition that the silent man who had just entered that bedroom was enacting a kind of justice the legal system would never provide. She returned to her room. She lay awake, listening. The house remained quiet. No screams, no struggle, no sounds of violence, just silence, deep and complete. When Hammond's agonized moaning began just before dawn, Dinah was already in the kitchen starting the fire, preparing breakfast. She was there when Hammond's wife began screaming, when the doctor was summoned, when chaos erupted through the household. And when the sheriff arrived to question everyone, Dinah said nothing about what she had seen, nothing about the figure on the stairs, nothing about Silas entering the locked bedroom. But silence has a way of festering, especially when weighted with knowledge that might save lives or condemn them. Dinah carried what she knew through the remainder of 1842 and into 1843, watching Silas when he occasionally returned to the Hammond plantation for additional work, observing him with a mixture of fear and something close to awe. He never acknowledged her with anything more than the briefest glance, but she felt certain he knew that she had seen him. They existed in a state of mutual silence, each holding knowledge that could destroy the other. The seventh attack occurred in November 1843. The victim was Daniel Merrick, a particularly brutal plantation owner whose cruelty was notorious even by the standards of the region. Merrick owned a large plantation near the Waccamaw River, with more than 40 slaves working rice fields that generated substantial profits. He was known for creative punishments, thumb screws, the stocks, brutal whippings for minor infractions. He was also known for his appetites, which extended to both enslaved women and younger men. The enslaved community on his plantation lived in constant terror. Silas had been sent to Merrick's plantation in early November to construct a new storage building for rice harvesting equipment. The project required 10 days of work. Silas slept in a locked corn crib, took his meals away from the other enslaved people, and worked with mechanical efficiency. On the third night of his stay, Merrick visited the corn crib. What happened during that visit was known only to 2 people, but 9 days later, when Silas had completed his work and returned to the Rutledge plantation, Merrick was found by his overseer in the plantation office, castrated with the now familiar precision. By this point, 7 plantation owners had been attacked. The pattern should have been obvious, but it remained hidden because the necessary information was fragmented across different plantations, different jurisdictions, different social circles that communicated poorly. The victims had formed an informal association, meeting occasionally to share information and theories, but their shame and reluctance to discuss certain details prevented them from seeing the pattern. They knew they were being targeted by someone with detailed knowledge of their homes and habits, but they couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge the common thread. That common thread was Silas, the silent carpenter who moved between plantations like a ghost, working diligently, observing carefully, remembering everything. He had developed his method over years: identify the locations where he was most vulnerable, determine the layout of plantation houses through casual observation during his work, note the patterns of patrols and overseer movements. Then, when the time came, he would escape from whatever shed or building where he was locked at night. Locks were simple devices, easily manipulated with the right tools, and as a carpenter, he had access to tools. He would make his way to the house of his target. Getting inside locked houses required patience and careful observation. During his days working on a property, Silas would note which windows had loose frames, which doors had inadequate locks, where keys were kept. He learned that many plantation houses, for all their grandeur, were poorly secured. Locks were meant to keep enslaved people out, but they were often old, poorly maintained, opened with skeleton keys that a skilled carpenter could replicate. Windows could be shimmed open from outside if you knew which ones had loose fittings. Once inside, Silas moved with the confidence of someone who had studied his terrain. He knew where floorboards creaked, which rooms were occupied where servants slept, and he knew his targets would be alone, or, if with wives, those wives would be heavy sleepers, often aided by the laudanum that many wealthy women of the era used regularly. He would enter the bedroom silently, approach the sleeping man, and in one swift motion place a cloth soaked in chloroform, stolen from plantation medical supplies during his daytime work, over his victim's face. The man would struggle briefly, then lose consciousness. Silas would work quickly then, using surgical tools he had carefully acquired and hidden. The castration was performed with precision that suggested medical knowledge, though where Silas had learned such skills remained mysterious. Within minutes he would be gone, slipping back out of the house the way he had entered, returning to his locked shed to wait out the remaining hours before dawn. The chloroform explained why victims remembered so little. The surgical precision explained why most survived. Silas had no interest in murder, which would bring far more intense investigation. His revenge was specific: to take from these men what they had taken from him and others, to inflict a permanent reminder of their crimes, to transform sexual predators into damaged, broken creatures who would never assault anyone again. But Dinah's knowledge remained a ticking bomb. In early 1844, she made a decision that would change everything. She approached Reverend Thomas Clayton, a Presbyterian minister who served several lowcountry plantation churches and had a reputation as a reformer who occasionally, very carefully, spoke about the moral problems of slavery. Dinah requested a private conversation, an unusual request from an enslaved person to a white minister. Clayton, intrigued and somewhat suspicious, agreed to meet her in the Hammond Plantation Chapel. What Dinah told him that afternoon in February 1844 was fragmentary and careful. She didn't identify Silas by name initially, but she described seeing a man in the Hammond house the night of the attack, a man who shouldn't have been there. She described his silence, his careful movement, the way he had entered a locked room. She told Clayton she believed this same man was responsible for the other attacks, that he moved between plantations, that he was exacting revenge for something terrible. She didn't explicitly say what that something was. To do so would require acknowledging the systematic sexual violence that pervaded the plantation system, and such acknowledgement could get her killed. But she hinted, and Clayton, who was more perceptive than many of his peers, understood. Clayton faced an impossible choice. If he reported what Dinah had told him to the authorities, she would certainly be punished, possibly killed, for not coming forward immediately. The perpetrator would likely be caught and executed, but Clayton had enough moral imagination to understand that what he was dealing with wasn't simple criminality. It was revenge for sustained, systematic abuse. He asked Dinah why she was telling him this now, months after witnessing the attack. Her answer was simple: because there's going to be more. I can see it in him when he passes through. And maybe if somebody knows, if somebody understands what's really happening, something can change. Clayton made a decision that defied every social convention of his time and place. He said nothing to the authorities. Instead, he began his own quiet investigation, traveling between plantations, speaking to enslaved people under the guise of religious ministry, gathering stories that confirmed what Dinah had suggested. He learned about a silent carpenter named Silas. He learned about plantation owners who visited locked sheds at night. He learned about a pattern of horror that the white establishment refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it would require confronting the deepest moral rot of the slavery system. What Clayton didn't anticipate was that his investigation would draw attention. In a society built on surveillance and control, a white minister asking careful questions about plantation owners and their private behavior raised alarms. By summer of 1844, Clayton found himself called before a committee of concerned citizens in Georgetown, questioned about his activities, warned that his interference in plantation discipline was unwelcome. One committee member, a prominent plantation owner named Augustine Sheffield, was particularly direct. "We understand you've been asking questions about matters that don't concern the spiritual welfare of anyone, Reverend, questions that suggest you've forgotten your place and purpose here. That can be corrected or it can be concluded. The choice is yours." Clayton understood the threat. He stopped his investigation, or appeared to, but he kept detailed private journals documenting everything he had learned, writing in a personal shorthand that he believed would protect the information if his papers were ever seized. These journals, discovered in a Charleston estate sale in 1998, provide the most complete contemporary account of what was actually happening in the Lowcountry between 1836 and 1847. In one entry from August 1844, Clayton wrote, "I have learned the identity of the man they seek, though they know not whom they seek. He is called Silas, property of the Rutledge estate, a carpenter of some skill who cannot speak. I have learned why he cannot speak, the result of violence inflicted upon him as a boy of 13, the nature of which I cannot bring myself to write, even in this private record. I have learned what has been done to him repeatedly since, by men who saw his silence as invitation rather than injury, and I have learned what he has done in response. God forgive me, I cannot condemn him. The law would hang him without hesitation. But what law protects him? What justice exists for one such as he? I am meant to preach forgiveness and redemption, yet I find myself hoping he is never caught, that his terrible justice continues until every man who has violated him pays it full." Meanwhile, Silas continued his work, unaware that anyone had begun to piece together the pattern. The Rutledge plantation continued to profit from renting out their skilled carpenter, and Silas continued to move between properties, a silent presence that white society had learned to ignore completely. But something was changing in him. According to those who observed him during these years, the elderly, formerly enslaved people interviewed in the 1930 spoke of a man who seemed to be slowly disappearing even as he remained physically present. "He got thinner," one woman recalled, "like he was burning up from the inside. His eyes got darker, deeper. You'd look at him and feel like you were looking into a well with no bottom." Some folks started avoiding him, not because they thought he'd hurt them, but because being near him felt like being near something that had already died but forgot to stop moving. The eighth and final attack occurred in March 1847, and it would prove different from all the others in ways that would finally force the truth into the open. The target was Jonathan Caldwell, a 47-year-old plantation owner whose property sat along the Black River, one of the most profitable rice-growing regions in South Carolina. Caldwell was wealthy even by planter standards, owning more than 60 enslaved people and extensive land holdings. He was also a member of the state legislature, a position that gave him considerable political influence and protection. Unlike the previous victims, who had been reluctant to discuss their attacks publicly, Caldwell was known for his arrogance and his belief that his political connections made him untouchable. In early March 1847, Caldwell contracted with the Rutledge plantation to borrow Silas for a month-long project, the construction of a new overseer's house and the renovation of several slave quarters that had fallen into disrepair. It was an ambitious project that would require Silas to work on the Caldwell plantation for an extended period, longer than any of his previous assignments. The Rutledge estate manager, pleased with the substantial rental fee Caldwell was offering, agreed immediately. Silas was transported to the Caldwell plantation on March 3rd, along with the tools and materials he would need. The Caldwell plantation was larger and more brutal than most. The overseer, a man named Horace Strickland, was notorious for his violence. He carried a whip at all times and used it freely. The enslaved population lived in constant fear, worked past the point of exhaustion, and suffered punishments for infractions, real and imagined. Several people had died in the fields in recent years from overwork and untreated injuries. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with the kind of despair that comes from knowing no relief is possible, no escape available. Silas was assigned to sleep in a small workshop separate from the main quarters, a building where tools were stored and minor repairs completed. It was a wooden structure with a heavy lock on the door, bars on the single window. Strickland made a point of locking Silas in each night personally, checking the lock twice, warning him that any attempt to escape would result in a whipping that would leave him unable to work for weeks. Silas showed no reaction to these threats, simply nodded his understanding and went about his work during the day with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to every project. But Caldwell had noticed Silas almost immediately, and his attention carried a quality that anyone familiar with plantation dynamics would recognize. On the second evening of Silas's stay, Caldwell visited the workshop after dark. He stayed for more than an hour. When he left, his clothing was disheveled, his face flushed. Silas remained inside, standing motionless near the workbench, his face unreadable in the dim light of a single candle. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Caldwell would visit the workshop 2 or 3 times each week, always after dark, always staying for extended periods. The other enslaved people on the plantation noticed, as they noticed everything, but said nothing. Speaking about such things was suicidal. Strickland, the overseer, also noticed, but his response was to ensure Silas remained locked in securely, not to protect Silas, but to protect Caldwell's privacy and to ensure this valuable rented property didn't escape before completing the work that Caldwell had paid for. What none of them knew was that Silas had been planning something different this time. The extended duration of the project, the isolation of the workshop, the regularity of Caldwell's visits, all of it created an opportunity that hadn't existed with previous targets. Silas had been patient for 11 years, striking and disappearing, never caught, never even suspected, but something had shifted in him during those years. The careful calculation that had characterized his earlier attacks was giving way to something darker, more desperate. He was 32 years old, had lived half his life as a mute instrument of other people's desires and his own revenge, and he was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. On the night of March 24th, Caldwell made his usual visit to the workshop. But this time, Silas didn't wait for him to leave. This time, he didn't plan to slip out later, to enter a locked house while everyone slept, to complete his work in silence and disappear before dawn. This time, when Caldwell finished his assault and began to dress, Silas moved. The attack was swift and brutal. Silas had a carpenter's hammer hidden beneath his sleeping pallet, and he used it to strike Caldwell across the back of the head, hard enough to stun but not kill. Caldwell collapsed, conscious but disoriented, unable to cry out. Silas worked quickly then, using rope from his carpentry supplies to bind Caldwell's hands and feet, stuffing a rag into his mouth to muffle any sounds. Then he lit every candle in the workshop, creating a brightness that was unusual, almost ritualistic, and he retrieved the surgical tools he had carefully maintained over the years, cleaned and sharpened after each use, kept hidden in a secret compartment in his tool chest. What happened next took nearly an hour. Unlike the previous attacks, which had been executed with swift precision while victims were unconscious, this time Silas worked slowly, methodically, while Caldwell was fully aware. The castration was performed in stages, with long pauses between each cut, during which Silas would simply stare at Caldwell's face, watching the terror and pain, making no sound himself but ensuring his victim understood exactly what was happening and why. It was torture, deliberate and calculated, a reversal of power so complete that Caldwell, for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, understood what it meant to be utterly helpless, to have your body violated while you were powerless to prevent it, to know that no one would come to help you, because you were not considered fully human by those who held power over you. When Silas finally finished, he cleaned his tools carefully, put them away, and did something he had never done before. He unlocked the workshop door from the inside and walked out into the night, making no attempt to hide, no attempt to return to the locked building before dawn. He walked across the plantation yard, past the main house where lamps still burned in some windows, past the quarters where enslaved people lay awake, listening to sounds they couldn't quite identify. He walked to the edge of the plantation property, to the river that marked the boundary, and he stood there, looking at the dark water as the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. He was found there at sunrise by Strickland, the overseer, who had discovered Caldwell in the workshop, screaming through his gag, barely conscious from blood loss and shock. Strickland had immediately organized a search, expecting to chase an escaped slave through the swamps. Instead, he found Silas standing calmly by the river, his hands still stained with blood, his face showing no emotion, no fear, no regret. When Strickland approached with 3 other white men, all armed, Silas made no attempt to run. He simply turned to look at them, and later Strickland would tell people that the look in Silas's eyes was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. Not rage, not madness, but something emptier and colder, like looking into the eyes of a man who had already left his body behind. Just when you think you understand the full scope of this horror, remember that Caldwell was the 8th victim we know about. How many others might there have been? Attacks that went unreported, victims too ashamed to admit what had happened to them. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content that doesn't shy away from the brutal truths of American history. And don't forget to subscribe. We have more stories like this one, tales that history tried to bury. Now, let's see what happened when the truth finally came out. They arrested Silas immediately, shackled him with irons on his wrists and ankles, locked him in a storage shed on the Caldwell plantation while they decided what to do. Caldwell was taken to Charleston for emergency medical treatment. He survived, like all the previous victims, but the injury was catastrophic and permanent. News of the attack spread rapidly through the Lowcountry, and for the first time, the authorities began to seriously investigate whether this might be connected to the previous incidents. Sheriff Carr, who had been investigating these attacks for more than a decade, traveled immediately to the Caldwell plantation. For the first time, he had an actual suspect in custody. The interrogation began the following day, March 26, 1847, in a small room in the Georgetown courthouse, where Silas had been transferred under heavy guard. Present were Sheriff Carr, 2 deputies, the district attorney, and Reverend Clayton, who had been summoned at Carr's request because he was known to have the trust of enslaved people, and might be able to get Silas to communicate despite his inability to speak. The interrogation transcript, part of the sealed documents later archived by the South Carolina Historical Society, makes for disturbing reading. Silas was brought in chains into the room, his hands shackled to a ring bolted into the floor. He sat without resistance, his face showing no expression, his damaged throat making occasional involuntary sounds, but no words. Sheriff Carr began with direct questions. "Did you attack Jonathan Caldwell? Did you castrate him?" Silas nodded slowly to both questions. No denial, no attempt to escape responsibility. Then Carr asked the question that mattered. "Have you done this before? Are you responsible for the other attacks?" Silas stared at him for a long moment, then nodded again. The men in the room exchanged glances. They had suspected, but confirmation was different. Carr pressed further. How many men have you attacked?" Silas held up both hands, fingers spread. 8. Carr felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why did you do this?" It was Reverend Clayton who intervened then. He had brought paper and pencil, thinking Silas might be able to write. But when he offered them, Silas shook his head. He couldn't read or write. Literacy was illegal for enslaved people, and he had never been taught. So Clayton tried a different approach. He began asking yes or no questions, and Silas responded with nods or headshakes. The conversation that followed, reconstructed from Clayton's journal and the official transcript, revealed the pattern that had been there all along, hidden by shame and silence. "Did these men hurt you?" Clayton asked. Silas nodded. "Did they force themselves upon you?" Silas's nod was slower this time, but definite. "All 8 of them." A nod. "Did this happen to you when you were young, when your voice was damaged?" A nod. "And it continued to happen whenever you were sent to work on other plantations?" A nod. Clayton turned to look at Sheriff Carr. "Sheriff, I believe we need to investigate the circumstances under which these attacks occurred. I believe this man has been subjected to systematic sexual violence for nearly 20 years, and what he did was retaliation." The room fell silent. The district attorney, a man named Harrison Felder, finally spoke. "That's not a defense under law, Reverend. Slaves have no legal right to retaliate against their masters for any reason. Even if what you suggest is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, it doesn't matter. This man mutilated 8 white men of standing. He'll hang for this." But Carr was looking at Silas with an expression that suggested he was finally understanding something he had been deliberately avoiding for years. "The pattern," he said slowly. "He was present on every property shortly before each attack. We could have found this connection years ago if we'd been looking at the movement of rented slaves, but we didn't look because we didn't want to see what we'd find." He turned to Felder. "If we put him on trial, if this becomes public, every detail will come out. Why he was sent to these plantations, what happened to him while he was there, why 8 respectable plantation owners all had this silent slave in their possession right before they were attacked. Do you want those details in the public record?" Felder understood immediately. A public trial would require testimony about what the victims had done to Silas, would require acknowledging the systematic sexual violence that pervaded the plantation system. It would be humiliating for the victims, disruptive to the social order, potentially inspiring other enslaved people to acts of resistance. "Better to handle this quietly," Felder said, "to avoid the publicity that would come from a trial." "What are you suggesting?" Felder asked carefully. "I'm suggesting," Carr said, "that we document what we need to document, that we close these cases as solved, and that we handle the punishment without a public spectacle that serves no one's interests." What followed was a bureaucratic exercise in concealment. The official record would show that Silas, property of the Rutledge plantation, had confessed to 8 counts of assault on plantation owners between 1836 and 1847. The motive would be listed as unknown or general rebellious disposition. The specific details of what had been done to Silas, what had motivated his attacks, would not be included in any official document. The victims would not be required to testify about their private activities. The pattern would be noted but not explained, and Silas would be executed quietly and without public announcement to avoid creating a martyr or inspiring copycat attacks. But Reverend Clayton refused to let it rest there. In the days between Silas's interrogation and his scheduled execution, Clayton visited him twice in his cell, bringing paper and pencil, even though Silas couldn't write, sitting with him in silence, trying to offer some form of spiritual comfort to a man who had lived through horrors Clayton could barely comprehend. During the second visit, Clayton asked Silas if there was anything he wanted people to know, anything he wanted Clayton to record for history. Silas stared at him for a long moment, then reached for the pencil Clayton had brought. His hand was shaking, but he managed to draw something, not words, but images. A boy's face with his mouth open, screaming, a hand covering that mouth, darkness, then 8 crosses scratched heavily into the paper. Then nothing more. Clayton understood. The 8 crosses represented Silas's victims, but they also represented something else. 8 times that Silas had taken back some measure of power, had made his attackers feel a fraction of what he had felt. It wasn't justice in any legal sense, but it was the only justice Silas had ever been able to claim. Clayton carefully preserved the drawing in his journal, where it remains to this day, a stark visual testimony to violence that official records tried to erase. The execution was scheduled for April 15, 1847, to be carried out at dawn in the Georgetown Courthouse Square. But 2 days before the scheduled date, something unexpected happened. Silas was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, using strips of cloth torn from his blanket, but there were inconsistencies in the report that raised questions then, and continue to raise questions now. The cell was supposedly under constant guard. The cloth strips would have required considerable time to tear and braid into a rope strong enough to support a man's weight, and several people who saw the body noted bruising around the throat that seemed inconsistent with self-inflicted hanging. Whether Silas took his own life, or whether he was killed to prevent a public execution that might draw unwanted attention, that question was never officially answered. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery reserved for enslaved people, a location that has since been lost to development and time. There is no headstone, no memorial, nothing to mark where Silas the Silent finally found silence in death. The 8 plantation owners who survived Silas's attacks lived with their injuries and their shame for the rest of their lives. Several left the region, moving to other states where their histories were unknown. Others remained but became reclusive, their damaged bodies constant reminders of what they had done and what had been done to them in return. Jonathan Caldwell resigned from the state legislature shortly after his recovery, citing health reasons. He sold his plantation in 1849 and moved to Virginia, where he died in 1856, leaving behind no public record of what had happened to him. Nathaniel Grayson, the first victim, lived until 1861, long enough to see the beginning of the Civil War that would eventually destroy the system that had enabled his crimes. He never married, never spoke publicly about his attack, and died isolated and alone in the house where it had occurred. The Rutledge plantation continued to operate until 1865, when the Union Army's occupation of South Carolina effectively ended slavery in the region. The plantation buildings were burned during the war, and the land was eventually divided and sold. No records survive of what happened to the enslaved people who had lived there, including those who had known Silas, worked alongside him, perhaps even suspected what he was doing during those 11 years. They scattered after emancipation, seeking family members sold away, trying to build new lives in a society that offered freedom in name but little in practice. Some of their descendants still live in the Lowcountry, though few know their connections to this history. Reverend Thomas Clayton continued his ministry in South Carolina until 1852, when he resigned and moved to Pennsylvania a state where he could work more openly with abolitionist organizations. His journals were inherited by his daughter, who preserved them carefully but never published them. She understood that the stories they contained were too dangerous, too revelatory, too challenging to the narratives that both North and South wanted to tell about slavery. Those journals passed through several generations of Clayton's descendants before being donated to a historical society, where they remained largely unexamined until the late 20th century. The sealed document that contains the official record of Silas's crimes and execution was deposited in the South Carolina Historical Society archives in 1847 with instructions that it not be opened without special permission. That restriction remained in place for more than 150 years. When a graduate student named Michelle Torres finally gained access to the document in 2003 as part of her dissertation research on plantation violence, she found not just the story of Silas, but dozens of other cases, documented instances of enslaved people resisting their treatment in ways that ranged from subtle sabotage to outright violence, all deliberately obscured in official records to avoid acknowledging that enslaved people had agency, intelligence, and the capacity for strategic resistance. Torres's dissertation, published in 2006, brought Silas's story back into public knowledge for the first time in over a century. The academic community's response was mixed. Some historians praised her work for illuminating a form of resistance that had been systematically erased from historical narratives. Others criticized her for potentially glorifying violence or for speculating about details that couldn't be definitively proven. But what no one could dispute was the central truth that her research had uncovered. Silas was not an isolated case. The sexual violence that he experienced that drove him to his terrible revenge was endemic to the slavery system, and resistance to that violence, while often hidden or disguised, was far more common than historical records suggested. Today, there is no memorial to Silas in South Carolina, no historical marker noting what happened in the Lowcountry between 1836 and 1847. The plantations where he worked have largely disappeared, replaced by suburban development or reclaimed by forest. The courthouse where he was interrogated still stands but is now a museum that focuses on more palatable aspects of the region's history: Revolutionary War heroes, antebellum architecture, natural beauty. The darker stories, the ones that reveal the true human cost of slavery, remain largely untold in official historical narratives. But in certain communities, particularly among descendants of enslaved people in the Lowcountry, the story of Silas the Silent has been preserved through oral tradition. It's told as a ghost story, sometimes a tale of revenge from beyond the grave. Other times, it's told as a cautionary tale about what happens when people are pushed beyond endurance, when systems of oppression become so brutal that resistance becomes inevitable, no matter the cost. And occasionally, it's told as a story of justice, imperfect, terrible, but justice none the less, enacted by someone who had no other recourse, no other way to make his suffering mean something. The question of whether Silas was a victim, a villain, or something more complex than either category allows continues to generate debate among historians and ethicists. He killed no one, but he inflicted terrible injuries on 8 men. Those injuries were acts of revenge for sexual violence he suffered repeatedly over nearly 2 decades. Does that make him a hero, a criminal, a symptom of a system so morally bankrupt that it created the conditions for such desperate acts? The answer perhaps depends on whether you believe justice can exist outside the law, whether revenge can ever be righteous, whether a person who has been denied every form of legal protection and human dignity can be judged by the standards of a society that refuse to acknowledge their humanity. In the first place, what cannot be debated is the historical reality that Silas's story represents. He was one person, but his experience was shared by countless thousands who were never named, never remembered, whose resistance, whether through violence, flight, sabotage, or simple survival, has been systematically erased from the narratives we tell about American history. Every plantation had its secrets, its hidden violence, its buried stories. Silas is unusual only in that his story eventually came to light, preserved in sealed documents and private journals by people who recognized that the truth, however terrible, deserved to be remembered. So, what do you think of this story? Was Silas justified in what he did? Could there have been any other form of justice available to him? Leave your comment below and let me know your thoughts. These historical conversations matter because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past. If you found this story compelling and want more deep dives into the dark corners of American history, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Share this with someone who appreciates history that doesn't look away from the hardest truths. And remember, these aren't just stories from the past, they are foundations of the present, patterns that echo through generations. Understanding them is the first step toward ensuring they never repeat. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget that behind every historical statistic, there were real people with real lives, real suffering, and sometimes terrible choices that made perfect sense in their desperate circumstances.